Again, thank you, Ludovic, and welcome everyone. I'd like to start off the panel today, starting with Ken Timsit. If you would introduce yourself, the company or organization you're representing, and a little bit of what you're doing related to digital assets. Ken?
Sure. So hi, I'm Ken Timsit. I work at the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, and also at Consensys, where I'm in charge of our enterprise activities. We have a number of projects going on right now around the creation and management of tokenized financial assets and tokenized assets in general. A few of the ones that we can talk about publicly include Liquid Share, a platform that we are developing with Euronext, Caisse des Dépôts, and a number of French banks to perform post-trade processing of stocks in listed companies on the blockchain in order to reduce transaction delays and reduce costs. We also have a joint venture with a subsidiary of the Singapore Stock Exchange, through which we are using the blockchain to tokenize shares in private companies and allow a more liquid and more efficient secondary market to operate around them. And we have a project that I can't talk about specifically, but that's around the distribution of fund shares. So it tokenizes shares in mutual funds and uses the blockchain to keep in sync all the distributors and intermediaries associated in the distribution of funds. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Hoffman. I'm from the University of Southampton in the UK. So I'm part of the Web Science Institute, where we investigate blockchains. As part of our research, we're working on decentralizing scholarly communications, and we have recently launched University of Southampton token, SOT, using Ethereum blockchain, using Aragon open source governance framework. So I'm very much interested in this area and happy to contribute to the panel. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Simone Paulo. I'm the managing director of LGO Exchange, who, as the name suggests, is an exchange branch of the LGO Group. LGO Group is a company that aims to provide all the infrastructure to issue and exchange digital assets with a special emphasis on security and fairness. And we have conducted an ICO a year ago, so we have first-hand experience on digital asset issuance. And since then, we have built an exchange platform for those digital assets and a platform for conducting sales of those digital assets.
Hey everyone, I'm Mathieu Cottin, the head of business development at Tokeny. So Tokeny is what we call a tokenization platform. We provide our customers with solutions to first issue, manage, and transfer digital assets. So for the issuance, we ensure the onboarding of investors in a compliant way. We provide solutions to the issuer to deploy the smart contracts and so on. For the transfer, we know that we are facing highly regulated products, so we make sure that our clients have the tool to manage and ensure the compliance. And we also provide solutions for the servicing, meaning solution to manage all the interaction between the issuer and the investor during the full life cycle of the token.
Okay, thank you very much. So welcome everyone, and I've got some questions to start off with. I'm going to start off with Simone. What are the basic benefits of issuing assets in the form of tokens?
I think there's quite a many. We've had a very short overview at the beginning during the introduction of what's the advantage, what are the numerous advantages of issuing a token. I would highlight maybe a few of them. I think the most important is that you are creating a fully digital and programmable asset. that benefits from the infrastructure on which it is built. So basically, if you are using, for example, a public blockchain, you will benefit from the decentralization of the network, and then from the censorship resistance of the network, the fact that every transactions are public and auditable, and this provides a lot of interesting use cases for the life cycle of the digital assets. And then from there, of course, the asset is digital, so it's programmable. You can easily insert some specific functions into your digital asset to make it usable in a way and not in another. Again, this has a lot of different use cases, and one of the most simple use case being that, for example, you can decide under which conditions your digital asset will be transferable, for example, what will be its behavior. You can program the distribution of dividends. You can program a lot of different things. And you can program them in the infrastructure on which it is built, which means if you use smart contracts on a public blockchain, for example, that you cannot change the rules afterwards. And this provides some guarantees for the owners of these digital assets, because you won't be able, even as the issuer, to change the rules that you have set beforehand. So that's from a transparency perspective, and from a infrastructure perspective, that's very interesting per se. And maybe I can add the fact that if you are issuing your token, your digital asset, on a public blockchain, on which there is also other applications that are deployed, you will be able to use this token on those applications. There's a huge trend going on right now on the blockchain space. It's called decentralized finance. It's a fancy word to say that we are the blockchain startups are building financial applications that are using the digital assets to create complex products and new use cases. And if you are, of course, issuing your token on the same platform, on the same blockchain as those decentralized finance applications or other applications, you can use them with those applications and more importantly, allow the people who have bought, who are the users of those digital assets, to do this without your authorization, because it's a public blockchain. So they can use your token on ways that maybe you haven't anticipated, and this provides a good flexibility and good new potential use cases for your token, even some that you didn't even imagine at the time when you issued your token. And the last thing maybe is that, but that's more specifically aimed to tokens that are issued on so-called ICOs. Usually, this mean of distributing those tokens helps you create a community around your project, people that are really heavily involved in the future of what they've financed. They are the owner of something that's really important for the future of the project, and they are, some of them, of course, not all of them, but you can have good allies with those investors that are potentially more diverse and more distributed than in a traditional securities offering. That would be the main benefits that I can list right now.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask Mike. So Mike, you're with Southampton University, and you've issued tokens. And what are you seeing as the benefits? What were you seeking, the benefits of issuing assets in the form of tokens?
Yes, so I think what Simone said was a great overview. If I may just add some minor points to that, what I could additionally think of with a security tokens, you also look at benefits like fractional ownership, where like when you have a traditional way of exchanging assets on an exchange, you always trade down to the like 0.01. But in a digital asset, most of them most of the tokens actually go down to 18 decimal points. So you can express a really small interest in something or a really small stake in something. So that fractional ownership is a huge selling point of security tokens. And another thing which I could add is a lot of digital assets, a lot of securities have very complex payoffs associated with them. For example, dividends that are structured in many different ways. So with digital assets, the cost of orchestrating that, and it's mostly what Simone said about the programmability of the digital asset. So the business logic is so cheap, it's so inexpensive to implement in the form of smart contracts. So things like dividend payments actually are quite cheap. So they're very cost efficient. And to answer your question, Susan, about our token, the SRT token is actually, it's not per se a security token, it's a utility token to express voting as part of scholarly communications. So it wouldn't have most of these benefits, but it's just a cheap way for us to implement voting mostly on the most important matters, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And Mathieu, I'm sorry, Mathieu, am I saying your name correctly? Mathieu. So you were with TokenE, and what are the benefits of issuing assets in the forms of tokens from your experience and what you're doing today?
So I think we have quite a complete answer already. If I can add something, is would be a special focus on the automation. If we look at private markets today, the trust is usually brought by lawyers and notaries, and these experts have usually a very local knowledge. And if you want to enjoy the full benefit of tokenization, you want to go worldwide. So you need to automate some of their work to be able to compile all the requirements that you will have to respect in every single jurisdiction where your token will be traded. So it's really the same advantages as the digitalization, I would say.
Thank you. And Ken, being part of Consensys, you have a lot of exposure to many different projects and issuing of assets in the form of tokens. So you've got a very nice broad view as well. And what benefits are you seeing of issuing assets in the form of tokens?
So I'd like to perhaps be clear in the sense that the benefits that we're talking about are, in my view, promised benefits. I don't think that we have collectively realized them yet. The benefits are, from an efficiency standpoint, in terms of the cost of ownership, managing the registry of ownership of a financial assets, are substantial. There are projects like the liquid share project where we estimate that we could divide the unit cost of a trade by a factor of 4. But in order to get there, we need sufficient volume so that we can amortize fixed costs. And we're definitely not there yet. So I think collectively, we are seeing the promised benefits in the form of automation, lower maintenance of the cost of registry, and creation of more liquid secondary markets. But we are still at the very beginning of the creation of those new financial markets, in the same way that mortgage-backed securities and other financial instruments in the US took many years of market evolution and regulatory developments before they became real financial markets. So we talked about secondary markets as well. And so I think in most cases, when we're working with financial institutions to tokenize the financial assets, the end goal is to make that asset more easily tradable on a secondary market. It's important to note that making it easier to trade a security doesn't mean that there is always demand for that security. You can't create demand or liquid markets out of nowhere, but there are situations in the context of small-sized real estate investments, in the context of some bond products, some structured bond products, and some derivatives. There are some contexts where there is a belief that right now there is some demand for a secondary market, and the market infrastructure doesn't support it. And so we're trying to enable the creation of those markets.
Thank you. And that's a great lead into the following question. So before issuing digital assets, since there's a lot of big ideas, and we're going to talk about use cases this afternoon, but prior to issuing digital assets, there seems to be many major aspects for consideration. Some of these include what is the legal structure of the asset, different characteristics of the token, technology standards. And so within each of your experience, what are the key elements that really must be considered when issuing digital assets? And I'll open it up to anyone to start. Matthew?
Well, I usually, when we engage with customers at TokenE, we usually try to organize the work into 3 different categories. First, we want to be clear regarding what they want to tokenize. They need to define what they want to tokenize. What does the token represent? What are the benefits associated to the tokens? What are the revenues right for investors? They really need to define all these aspects linked to the token. Once they've done this job, they usually need to ensure the compliance in their operation. So ensuring the compliance in a tokenization project, it means not only looking at the jurisdiction where you're setting up the operation, but it's also looking at every single jurisdiction where you're targeting investor. And you will have to run the proper legal work depending on the type of investors you want to target, depending also on the amount you want to raise. So it's a very complex work, and that's why usually it requires to work with many or several legal partners or global law firms. And the last, is to make sure that you're obviously joining the right ecosystem. So we know that you have different blockchains, they all have different characteristics, and depending on your project, you need to have a close look to make sure that you're finding the right ecosystem for your needs.
Thank you.
From our experience of when we issued the LGO token, the main question we had to answer really boils down to what is the value proposition of the token you are issuing for the investor. And you need to find a value proposition. You need to have a value proposition that really makes sense in the business model you are implementing. In our case, as an exchange platform, we went for a token that allows customer to pay the trading fees. So it's really integrated inside of our business model, because you need to engage in the long term the persons that will be buying your digital assets. So you really need to create it in a way, to structure it in a way that makes sense in the long term for the investor. So that's for me the most important point. And then from there, you move to the issuance part, because you have your asset, and now how will you issue it? How will you sell it? And that's where the technical and the legal questions arise. I think the technical ones are very important and sometimes neglected. You have huge security risks linked to the issuance of those tokens. And you need to make sure that the platform you are using for issuing those tokens, or the smart contract, or whatever the mean you use to issue your tokens, you need to make sure that it's completely battle tested and audited, and everything will work as you intend to be. And then, so that includes, of course, the choice of the platform and the choice of the provider, technical provider, if you need them. And then, of course, from the legal perspective, then you have all the hurdle of AML KYC procedures that you have to implement by yourself or using a partner. And then depending on the type of token, because that's for all the tokens, of course, and then depending on the type of token you issue, if you issue a security token, then you have huge legal hurdles to overcome to be able to respect the regulation and make an asset that makes sense at the same time. And this is a bit different for the UTT token and the payment tokens for now. But in any case, the legal questions are very important and very difficult to tackle, because there's still a lot of uncertainties for every single actor involved in the field, including the regulators. So this usually involves discussions with the said regulators directly, to make sure that what you are trying to make won't cause you too much trouble afterwards.
And we're going to have another question on that as well, to delve into that a bit further on the legal side in a few minutes. Thank
Great.
you. So Mike, going back just to remind everyone of the question that we're on is, what are the key elements to consider before issuing digital assets? And in your experience, what are some of the most important?
Yeah, I think this has been covered great so far by the previous two panelists. If I may add, one simple question, but it's actually very complex, is can I sell whatever I'm trying to sell or issue outside of the blockchain easier or at all? For example, it wouldn't make sense to tokenize my house if I could then sell it through an estate agent. And I could also sell it through a token at the same time. But the biggest pain point is that the blockchain doesn't actually fully capture that ownership change at that point because I've just sold it outside of the blockchain. So the question is, how does this actually feed into existing processes and structures for selling things? And another thing would be, I think, mostly covered so far, the tokenomics, so the type of token I'm creating. Standards are quite important, but it's not just the standards for the token. Like, my question is not just what sort of token I'm issuing, what standard does it adhere to, but how does it adhere to wider blockchain standards for things like identity, I think is key. Because when I'm selling something, I have to prove this is me and I can prove this identity. And another thing I may have to prove is any other sort of claims that I have associated with my asset. So there are some standards, again, most of our research is on the Ethereum platform. So for example, ERC 725 for identity management, ERC 735 for verifiable claims. So I would need to make sure I have a way of identifying myself and making claims that can be easily checked by other parties. So there's a lot of cryptography involved in that, but that's out of scope of the panel.
Thank you. And Ken, on some of the projects that you're working on and Consensys is working on now, what are some of the key elements you're finding really need to be considered before issuing digital assets?
So from a legal and regulatory standpoint, as you know, there is now a growing body of recommendations and guidelines from various geographies that propose various definitions for what is a consumption token, what is a security token, what is a payment token. Of course, legal advice is needed to position the project in the best possible way. Usually, right now, although we're seeing a great progress and innovative proposals coming from European countries, and I know we have a representative from AMF in the room. Today, that's really promising. At the same time, the elephant in the room is the fact that the US regulation right now is both the clearest one and the most restrictive, defining very specific conditions under which a consumption token or utility token can be launched. And so we're usually referring to that regulation as the main framework to structure the asset and then translating that the properties of that asset into the various regulatory frameworks that exist all around the world. Now, from a technical standpoint, I think that right now we're seeing a lot of evolution as well, and so that's part of the things to consider. I think that generally the idea that a token can be the representation of an asset, financial or otherwise, and is a simple object of value that gets transferred from users to users. I think that's well accepted. The proof of concept has been done many times by issuers of ICOs and STOs. I think now when we talk to financial institutions, we get the sense that those very basic properties are now a little bit last year. I would say, I think right now people are more and more investigating what specific enhancements can be brought to the token standards like ERC20 that purely represent a basic unit of value. So we're having extensive discussions about a few things. One is around, for debt products, how to structure the coupon payments and and the cash flows. And so what is all the logic that can be incorporated into the smart contract to replicate the business rules that govern the calculation of cash flows around the financial instrument. And so there's a lot of work going on there, and it's not straightforward at all. There's a second set of discussions that are going on around privacy. And so there are some cryptographic advances, some of them open source, some of them closed source, that have resulted in the creation of different types of tokens, usually based on unspent transaction outputs. So it's more like a Bitcoin type of model than a Ethereum type of model, but applied to Ethereum. And then using those new types of tokens allows someone to transfer tokens to each other in a private way without divulging the amount of the transaction, and in some cases also the addresses of the senders and the receivers. And then the third real big field of exploration to consider right now is what kind of interoperability you would like to have for the token. More and more people are considering issuing tokens on public networks, but making it possible for those tokens to transfer to private trading venues, dark pools, where they can have privacy of transactions and market finality that is more robust than on the public networks. And so all those enhancements really need to be incorporated very early on in the discussion, because they require technological choices that cannot be made too late in the process.
Thank you. So that is a great lead-in as well. The next topic area we're going to discuss with the issuance of digital assets is around technology. So Ken just mentioned a few key points. And are there best practices? There's a two-part question. Are there best practices in place when making technical choices? And what are the technical choices and steps that you need to go through before issuing digital asset tokens? Who would like to start on that? I see Mathieu nodding, so I'm starting with you.
Well, I think regarding the technical choices, it's important to keep in mind that you have to work on two sides. Obviously, you have a lot of work to do on the blockchain side, creating the smart contract to represent the digital asset you're issuing. But it's also important to keep in mind that you need to provide the right interfaces. So anyone who needs to interact with these tokens has a very easy and understandable tool to do so. So it's really working on both sides, the smart contract and the right interfaces. If you're issuing a token representing equity, well, if one of your investors happen to lose his private key, you need to have a process in place to make sure that he can still benefit from being an investor in such company. So it's not only the smart contracts, it's also the interfaces that goes on top of the smart contracts to manage the relationship between the issuer and anyone who will acquire these tokens.
Yeah, so I concur. Interfaces for the issuance itself is really critical. On the technical side, on the blockchain, you have a lot of different standards that are built on each and every blockchain now. Programmable blockchain, of course. The most well-known would be the ERC20 tokens on the Ethereum blockchains, who are maybe the most well-known form of token existing now. But you have different types of standards. You have standards for security token around ERC 1400. And you have all those standards on which a lot of different actors are working because it's their best interest to improve the standard when they've made improvements. So all those standards are open source, and you have to study them and find a way to implement them the best way possible when you are willing to issue a digital asset. Otherwise, the downside of the smart contracts being that you can easily make some mistakes that can be very costly. So beginning with standards and then adapting them to your specific use case and then, of course, implementing a specific audit to make sure that technically everything's online and to limit as much as possible the risks. That's mandatory if you really want to issue a token on a blockchain today. And of course, you have to make sure that the link between the smart contract and the interface you are building is secured and really makes sense, really implements, because your user will use the interface, and you have to ensure that everything that is made on the interface is completely replicated on the blockchain side.
Mike, and also, Mike, are you finding that from your position, you're seeing that there are best practices out there, the choices and the steps that have to be taken before issuance, or is it too early to have best practices across the board?
It's a very good question. I think the best practices are still crystallizing. What's happening, though, is that open source communities have a lot of active discussions on standards, and these standards then become de facto best practices. And speaking of open source, which was already mentioned by you, Simon, I can't stress how important open source is in academia, because from a research point of view, research has to be reproducible, it has to be transparent. So open source blockchains are really the only real choice we have in academia for that. But taking Ethereum, for example, it has the most open source standards at the moment for lots of different use cases for tokens. So your use case will dictate the sort of standard and the sort of best practices you'll be going for. So I think essentially with digital assets, they can be broken down into fungibles, non-fungibles, and refungibles, which is quite a new development. So ERC20, which was already mentioned many times, is your typical fungible token. And it's mentioned a lot, but it's actually not a very efficient implementation of a fungible token. So you've had a lot of upgrades to the standard along the years. So you've had your ERC223, which is basically more energy efficient. So that's a best practice if you're looking for having your transactions not just fast, but also, you don't want to destroy the planet. So you're looking at something like ERC223, where multiple steps are performed in a single transaction rather than multiple transactions, resulting, in optimization of performance. So then you have extensions of that. So you have ERC621, which can be used for things like limiting the supply of your token. So that's great for multiple issuances. That's great for use cases where you may have to manipulate the supply. So this could be used potentially in the future by banks for things like QE. So you have many extensions of that, tokens that deal with subscriptions. So you can implement subscriptions on a blockchain, so you can have payments scheduled automatically at given time interval. So that's all fungibles. And then you have best practices for non-fungibles. So non-fungibles are used to implement digital scarcity. So they are your typical digital assets, basically. So if you tokenize something as a non-fungible token, your standard is ERC721, where it's been there for a few years now. So there are many implementations of that. ERC721s can't be divided; they can't be combined. So it is a standard. It's been signed off, and if you have an ERC721, you know what you're expecting. You know what deal you're getting out of the token. And then obviously there's been variations of that. So if you want a non-fungible that works with more complex use cases like land registries, for example, you could look at ERC921, which is a delegated non-fungible token. So you can have a root jurisdiction that manages the root token and can be broken down into smaller zones, smaller areas that have their own composable non-fungibles, and so on and so on. And just not, I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but refungibles would be yet another set of best practices for stuff like curation markets, where price may not be the best mechanism for that market. So art, but also big pharma, you can use the programmability, the smart contracts essentially, to create things like bonding curves. So you can have supply of the token that's managed by the smart contract, so it could be slow at the beginning, then you can make it speed up in the middle once you've built a certain momentum, once you've got some people on board of that asset, and then you can make it die down at the end. So it's great for things like investing in new drugs. It's also used for curating many types of markets. So there are different types of best practices, but they will very much depend on your exact use case.
Very interesting. Thank you. Ken, did you have anything to add regarding the technical choices and the steps to decide before issuance? We're good? Okay. I'm going to start with Ken on this one then. For our next question, we're going to talk about legal considerations to overcome before issuing digital assets. So one question is what legal structure to issue the digital assets under, and what qualification for the assets themselves. So just related to the legal considerations when issuing digital assets. And I'll start with Ken. Oh, start. Okay.
I'm not sure I can say much more than
I need to know Simon was a lawyer in his previous life. So
3 years ago I was a lawyer. So yeah, of course the legal questions are very numerous, and it's very difficult to give a broad answer, like for all kinds of digital assets and all kinds of issuance. What I could say, but I think I already said this. It's like depending on the characteristics of the assets you are willing to build, which comes from the value proposition you are giving to your investors. You will enter into one or numerous categories of those categories that we have highlighted before. So payment tokens, security tokens, utility tokens, and the rules applicable to those different kinds of tokens are not set in stone right now, but we can anticipate pretty much. Then for now, everything that is a security must respect the security laws of the EU if you are issuing it into the EU, of course. And then from the other one, you are still in a gray area where you should probably care about the security rules anyways, because some of them will be adapted to this new asset class that is built on the blockchain. So basically, it's very difficult to give a straightforward answer, but you need to conduct a full analysis of the token that you are building and to anticipate the rules that you will need to apply to them. For security tokens, it's very straightforward because security laws are very detailed, and you have implementation issues coming from using the blockchain that you have to settle, but the rules applicable are very clear. And then you have all the gray area where you can anticipate pretty much from the publications of the different agencies, but you don't have any certainty today, especially in the EU. It's a bit more clear in the US and a bit more restrictive. That's what's applicable in the EU. But yeah, basically you have to do some anticipation work here.
Okay, unless anyone has anything to add on legal, just so we have time for questions, I'm going to move on to the next question. Okay, fantastic. So what are good practices to set up the issuance process and calendar? So for example, issuance with tranche, setting of the price when issuing assets. Would anyone like to jump in on that one? Mike?
Yeah, I just want to say it will really depend on the ecosystem you decide to go with, and it will be different on Securitize. It will be different on Polymath. It will be it will depend on what sort of exchanges you're using. It will depend on what your liquidity is supposed to be. If you want to use a particular liquidity protocol, you may have to spend some additional work to integrate with the protocol, like Banker or Open Finance. It depends on what the expectations are and what the level of services that you want to give to your users.
I'd maybe make one more comment, which is, again, if we go back to the classifications of assets that we're seeing coming out from regulators, clearly there is this distinction between utility or consumption tokens and security tokens. And from a timeline standpoint, what is very different is that utility tokens are expected to be used for an application. And in most cases, in order to justify pre-selling rights to access that application, some form of live version of the application needs to be available. And so I really think when it comes to utility tokens and thinking about the timeline, the most important thing is the product. So it's about really developing the technology and creating a service that is useful to its users, and then selling to those users the right to use the service by purchasing tokens. So really, the product development should be put front and center and as part of the early stages of the timeline. Whereas, of course, when you're talking about security tokens and you're simply raising funds for an entrepreneurial project, usually you start raising funds before you even start hiring people and working on the product. So the sequence is completely different. I think that's the main difference in terms of timeline. And then, of course, for those for those tokens that represent financial assets, the timeline is not very different from any other way that those financial assets would be issued. You need to work with the lawyers, need to do roadshow, need to find investors, need to build a book that's extremely similar. And it takes right now almost as much time as with the traditional financial assets, because the legal work that needs to be done is as substantial, if not more.
Anything to add from anyone? Okay, and before we go to audience questions, we have one final question for the panel, and then the audience will be able to ask questions of the panel themselves. What's involved in determining the right audience for the tokens? Is it just relatively simple? You know what your token's going to be, and therefore you know who's going to want it or need it? Or is there more to it than that?
I think we've done a very good job of avoiding using the term ICO, which I think historically has attracted the wrong audience in general. So STO's security token offerings would be the rebranding of that, which would be aimed at a very different audience, which is more mature. So there's definitely a branding aspect there. I don't know whether other panelists will agree with me on that.
I think it really boils down to what is the asset that you've built, and from there, of course, the targets of these assets will come naturally. I would say, if you are pre-selling a service, then your future customers are the person that you want to target. If you are selling a security token, an investment in your company, then every kind of potential investors for which your business activity makes sense and that wants to contribute and potentially have some reward for having financed you. So I think it comes really naturally once you've created your token and really defined what's the interest of the token. Then your targets comes naturally after that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Simon. I would say that when it comes to security tokens, the audience is not so different than a traditional offering. If we look more into utility tokens, and I do think that there will still be some good projects issuing utility tokens. The good example is I don't think that Ethereum would have done an STO. It's a clear example that utility token could still be needed. And when you do such operation, you need to keep in mind that you're building the future community of users. The spirit of doing ICO at the very beginning was to build this community, to get their feedback, and to be able to build a product that fits their requirements the most possible. So that's what you should keep in mind when when looking for the right audience. Try to avoid people who want to speculate with your token, but find the right people who are really interested in your product and who are willing to help you to go in the right direction.
Thank you. Ken, did you want to add anything, or we can go directly to questions? Okay, so we definitely have built in time for questions from the participants of the workshop. Would anyone like to ask a question of the panel?
Hi, Peter Mertz, advisor. Hi, guys. Thank you very much for the presentation. You guys covered legal and technology, but you haven't covered taxation. This digital, how you guys looking to work? Because there's not really clarification on that. Thank you.
Yeah. So I would say it depends on where you are located and what are the local rules that will be applicable to you. That again, very difficult to give a broad answer to this, especially because there seems to be that this is a very moving field, and for example, in France last year there was a specific law that adapted the taxation of the digital assets, so revenues on digital assets, but excluding specifically the security tokens. And so depending on the place where you're living, basically where you're a tax resident from, your tax issues will be completely different. Your taxation will be completely different. And
the reason I'm asking, because in the States you have 3 different kind of taxation for the futures, for the commodity as a CFTC, then you have the IRS, and then you have your SEC. So.
Depending on well, that's the legal analysis, I would say, and sometimes the tax analysis is not exactly the same. So you really have to go and see your tax advisor for that, because there's no clear rule, and it really depends on the jurisdictions you are in.
So some of the research we've done at the University of Southampton is to do with digital tax regimes, and blockchains actually present a fantastic platform opportunity for taxation, because currently, even in the European Union, every country would have their own database, and these databases have to be reconciled, which is essentially not a very efficient process, and it's also very costly. But we're obviously looking at a very long horizon of many years, where you could have ledgers. Blockchains are distributed ledgers with smart contracts that essentially reconcile automatically. So in the context of VAT, where huge amounts of money leak, like there's a huge VAT gap, we propose something that's called the VAT Invoice 2.0, which uses blockchains and linked data to automate VAT reporting across different countries to avoid things like VAT fraud, but it could also be used for avoiding base erosion and profit shifting. So there's a huge scope for blockchains and tax.
We have another question up the front.
Yeah, so I just want to make one. So this time is not just for questions, because we don't have all the knowledge in the world. So I just want to reiterate what Ludovic said earlier. You can also speak up to state your views or your experiences, or criticize what we've said previously.
Thank you for clarifying. Very good, Ken.
So you've mentioned STOs, ICOs, but what about airdrops to issue your tokens?
Just to make sure everyone is on the same page, airdrops is a process where you define conditions under which you basically distribute your token for free to a certain category of investors. So it could be the people who hold another token, or the people who have registered on a platform or something like that. And you create some value to this token after the distribution. This is a very broad question. What aspects do you want to cover?
Well, I mean, you talked a lot about the legal issues with ICOs, whether it's an SDO and all these kind of other issues, but airdrops kind of just miss the whole issuance conversation. So legally, is it a good way to get around certain hurdles? Isn't it a much easier way to issue your token, start your project? I mean, I'm just kind of surprised it was not mentioned.
Maybe I can comment a little bit on this. So I think airdrops specifically refer to utility tokens, right? And they are a way to jumpstart a community by giving a free right to use the service.
Sorry.
One of our activities is we're a startup incubator and investor. And so when you advise a number of startups, you realize that the most important thing for an early stage product is to find a core group of users who are passionate about the product and see clear utility for the product. So that process is called, in startup parlance, finding a product market fit. It's really discovering who are the users for which your product is absolutely essential and who will be the advocate of your product. I think doing airdrops, is a little bit the equivalent of doing a broad-based Facebook campaign to advertise your app. It's a great way to reach a broad audience, but it will not help you to find a product market fit. So it can be a starting point, but it's largely useless when it comes to discovering how to make your product repeatable and scalable. So I wouldn't advertise it as a market development strategy. I think it's just one tool, in the same way that doing broad-based Facebook advertising is a tool to get some people to know about your product.
Question.
Thank you. I think it was mentioned that the United States tend to better legislate blockchains and crypto assets than in the EU. Although, if I understood correctly, they tend to be also quite restrictive on their legislation. Could you just, is there a best practice from the United States? I think you mentioned one piece of legislation, which I couldn't get.
I don't know if anyone is best practice. They're just a practice that we cannot ignore. And so generally, I think what we're seeing is, so generally in the US, so I think Bitcoin is a commodity. And so that is a very specific treatment. Most tokens, so most digital assets are considered securities because the belief is that most people who purchase those assets are doing that with a primary objective being to make a financial gain. And that's the difference of a security. That's how a security is defined more or less in the US, which is very different from how it is defined in the European Union and in the UK, for example. Now, more and more, I think that there is some acknowledgement from US authorities that there are some situations where a digital asset should not be considered a security. And mostly it is if the asset is sold to the users of the product, if it is sold at a time when the product is already available, if it is sold in quantities that are compatible with what you would expect a user of the product to purchase, and if the users can demonstrate that they understand what the product is for and what they will use it for. And I think along those characteristics, which are similar to, I think those characteristics in terms of defining what defines a consumption token, I think those characteristics are quite helpful. They are implemented and enforced very, very rigorously in the US, but if you take those same principles and decide where you want to put the cursor, I think those characteristics are quite helpful everywhere in the world.
And if I may just add,
Yes.
also in the US you had Delaware sort of blockchain-friendly Senate bill number 69, and that's actually sanctioned the use of ERC 884 security token, which was the first jurisdiction that actually sanctioned a particular token standard anywhere. It's not to say that the ERC 884 is the best practice for security tokens, because then you've had like ERC 1400, which is much better. It has better integration with KYC, AML, etc. It's more efficient.
Thank you. We're going to have time for a few more questions. Gentleman on the end has been raising his hand.
So, Lucas Arepa, European Commission. Thank you again for the great discussion. It was very helpful. From your experience, how many tokens are still issued as pure utility tokens? And the question I'm asking is, according to the report that ESMA published, most tokens they saw are mixed tokens that have elements of utility plus investment. And if you look at the position that the SEC takes, it's actually a bit more restrictive, I would say, than you have described. I think the position of the SEC is to say the moment that any token, whatever functionality it has, can appreciate in value depending on the entrepreneurial effort of the company that issues it, it is a security. And that's actually very restrictive. So from what I've understood in the United States of America, the utility token is a dead instrument today. And what we see is that you either go with a security token offering that has to comply with Reg D under the Securities and Exchange Act, or you go outside of USA and you don't sell your tokens at all in the USA. So I would be interested to understand in the United States of America today, how many companies still issue what you would consider to be a utility token to the broad mass of investors.
So I think it's a question that has several parts in the answer, in my perception. So factually, right now, very, very few tokens are issued as utility tokens, primarily because the regulatory burden and risks are just too high to make the effort worthwhile. But there is a second reason, which is also that, generally speaking, this idea that this idea of variable value token, so non-stable token, so the idea that you're going to create a service and that people are paying for the service, but the price of the service becomes more expensive as the service gets more used. I think this is proven to be a little bit counterintuitive and not working for most services. You would expect most services to become cheaper as more people use them and to be more efficient and target a broader slice of the population. And so fundamentally, the reason why utility tokens have variable value is because it is extremely hard to purchase them from the traditional financial system and to exchange money from the token world to bank accounts. And I think besides regulation, the big missing piece right now is what we call stable tokens, right? So digital assets that would enable us to transact digitally at a low cost and in a way that is extremely efficient without having to deal with all the complications associated with variable rates and volatility. And so I think the regulation will get clarified, but more importantly, the broadening availability of stable tokens, some of which offered by large financial institutions, some of which offered by large US tech companies, some of which offered by European consortiums of banks and or government-sponsored financial institutions will make it possible for us to purchase utility tokens that are truly, purely rights to use the service. And then I think the efficiencies associated with being able to get customers to pay for a service in very, very small quantities will be truly demonstrated.
Thank you. We've got a lot of questions, and we will also be having a workshop this afternoon and a couple more panels. So if you don't get your question answered now, please ask again, but I'm going to go to this. woman in the front.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks very much for sharing your knowledge, your experience on this. As a representative of the European Commission, I'm working on the securities financial area. I'm particularly interested in the securities token, which represent financial assets. Where I understand from what Ken says that actually life cycle for issuance is very similar to traditional financial asset. So the question is, I would presume for you to confirm that then the existing regulatory framework would also apply to securities token, i.e., does it mean that based on your experience, would you consider that the status quo, the regulatory framework is suitable for securities token, or have you already identified clear obstacles preventing the issuance of security token? And if you have, could you share with us? Because this would also help on our side. And a second question, which perhaps anticipate also the second panel, so for you to decide whether you want to answer or not now, as whether with this perspective you would also see any evolution in the role of certain market stakeholders with specific regard to the issuance. For instance, what about the role of the issuer, the issuer agent? What about the role of the CSDs, Central Security Depository? Does it make sense to talk about book entry, fungibility of securities? Just food for thought. Thank you.
I think the most of those questions will be addressed by the next panel.
Thank you for the introduction.
And before we conclude this panel, the gentleman also had a burning desire for a question.
Well, actually, it's more of a sharing knowledge type thing. Going back to the first question about the benefits of utilizing blockchain technologies for, let's say, asset issuance and so forth. I think one that's often not covered and not looked at is balance sheet optimization for, if you look at the cost of covering the risk of non-delivery for assets in the traditional financial market. That's an area that doesn't get a lot of attention, I think, but for me, it's a big benefit as well. If you don't have to tie up cash on the balance sheet to cover for the risk of non-delivery, then you can deploy capital more efficiently.
Thank you. So let's give a round of applause to our very knowledgeable panelists. Thank you very much. And we will have our next panel starting right now. So if the panelists would like to come up. It's very interactive. Look how many questions. There's way too many. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to get all these questions. Okay, so we're ready to get started with our second panel. And this panel is going to be around considerations around custody, exchange, management, and usage of digital assets. We've already met Ken from Consensys. Welcome again, Ken. If you could each introduce yourselves, the organization that you're with, and what you're basically working on related to digital assets.
Thank you. My name is Alexandre Barrat. I work at the French AMF, the Financial Markets Authority, and I am Deputy Head of FinTech Innovation and Competitiveness.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Simon. I'm working for Commerzbank, and I've been working for 2 years now in our own DLT lab, doing mainly capital markets, and have led a capital market transaction with Siemens and Continental at the beginning of this year, where we had a purely digital settlement on ledger using a digital security issued on-chain only and cash on ledger, so digital money via our e-money license.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Hagen. I work for Coinhouse. Coinhouse is the leading crypto asset platform in France. We have both physical brick and mortar store in Paris and an online platform where one can securely purchase, sell, and secure crypto assets.
Okay, so I will put this question out to anyone, or each of you, anyone on the panel. And by the way, if you aren't compelled to answer the questions, so we have a lot of questions. We want to have a lot of engagement with the workshop. So if you want to answer, that's fine, but don't feel compelled to answer a question if you have nothing to add. Thank you. So what are the proven benefits of managing assets on-chain, and what are the challenges faced managing assets on-chain? Anyone like to start?
I can start maybe. I would say that the benefits are for now more promised benefits, as maybe you said, Ken, during the first roundtable. But I think that the promised benefits are basically cost reducing for the clients, so less depository fees, less custodian fees, less brokerage fees, and maybe a higher speed also. Well, maybe security also. Well, they are promises, as I said.
Thank you.
I would agree, but we can see on early transactions now that they are coming true, as far as I understand. So in our transaction, as we had digital security and digital cash, we could settle purely electronically on the platform. And so we didn't have to settle for 2 days as regular with securities in the market. That means that we don't have to take the counterparty risk for 2 days, which on our balance makes 25 million a year. And that's not only efficiency for the customer, but risk costs. And actually, as the settlement was done instantly, it was less than 2 minutes for the security settlement. We have much less structural risk because there is actually a counterparty risk. Of course, it doesn't take place always, but in 2008, we saw that it can take place, that there is a counterparty risk. So actually, our risk department quite likes technology because the risk of settlement is reduced systematically, and that is not something that is pulled through the market, but is generated because there is simply more efficient process in place. However, what is difficult? Put it into legacy. So you still have a lot of legacy systems within capital markets, and for this reason, you have to put everything on chain. If you have assets off chain that you have to synchronize, the cost of synchronization may be higher than regular transaction costs.
So it's the first time that I hear that the risk department quite likes blockchain. How far we've come.
Even better, our compliance likes it as well. Yeah.
Sorry. I'll just add one thing is managing assets on chain allows for transparency by design. And what that means really is also, and I'm going to try and delve into that example, is to have a proof of solvency also for regulators. When regulators are vetting money transmitters these days, they usually vet after the fact the integrity of the license holder's financial and accounting reports. And, you know, right now in the 21st century, in the second decade of the 21st century, we're still vetting based on paper-based reporting. Obviously, with a crypto bank and with a crypto, I would say, money transmitter, you could, publicly share your database of transactions to regulators, and allow for a more efficient, regulatory oversight of the actual assets, and the solvency of the actor itself. So I think, that is really one of the main benefit of managing assets on chain.
Thank you. And next we will discuss how to organize and design the transfer of the assets and the secondary market of the assets. So who would like to chime in with their experience on how to do this? Alexandre?
I'm sorry. Okay, maybe, well, it's more a legal answer, but by promoting good standards. And I think I should do an introduction of the PACT law, which was just enacted 2 days ago and published yesterday. And for secondary market, well, the law is divided for crypto assets in 4 parts. And here I'm going to talk about the secondary markets. So the new regime for digital asset service providers. This regime is mainly optional, and it is for 10 to regulate 10 services in France. 10 services. The first one is custody of assets, so the post trade. The second and the third one are the brokerage. The fourth one is exchanges, and these 4 first services were considered as strategic and as a priority. And the other services are transmission of orders, asset management, financial advice, and services to the issuers placing and undertaking, that's to say. So these services were... of course, the list was inspired by MiFID. So to come back to the question, the regime, the aim of the regime is to promote, with a whitelist approach, good standards, and especially for custodians and exchanges, which are often the same companies, but not always. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Simon?
Maybe just to add, what we experienced in our transaction is that actually the secondary and primary market model is disrupted. So you don't really need secondary and primary markets if you can enable the clients to issue themselves and to trade themselves. And we did so by getting rid of our own role as a trader. So the bank didn't have the security on their books anymore, and we didn't distribute it anymore. Instead, Continental as an issuer could issue with standardized legal frameworks upfront themselves, so they didn't need an originator. And then they simply sold it directly to Siemens because you have the security and the cash on ledger. So everybody that has a read access to the ledger can see that both assets can be settled immediately. So you don't need a dealer anymore for this kind of business. However, you need somebody who does, for example, a KYC for the parties, because otherwise Continental as an issuer would have to do a KYC for all possible investors, and each other issuer would have to do the same. So it doesn't make sense in terms of efficiency, of course. So I would say, and this is something also maybe for the legislation and something that we could propose, that also like primary and secondary market business is something that has developed out of a technology, actually, because the dealer was a way to scale the business. Yeah? And today we can scale the business not on a market side, but on a technological basis. So I'd also say if we propose that we have technologically neutral legislation, then this also means that we have to challenge current market standards and infrastructures.
Thank you. Ryan, did you have anything to add on this particular topic?
Not really. I'll just add that, digital assets are borderless by nature. So thinking of the design of, secondary market for digital assets needs to be needs to imply a lot of coordination, and that's why we're all here to actually have a European, debate about how we could, better design this secondary market. So really appreciate the the work the French government, the French regulator has done, and the French government has done on the PAC law. And I think, it needs to extend further to at a European level.
Thank you. So next, let's discuss how to organize the custody of digital assets. What are the good technical standards in terms of security? For example, offline storage, multi-signature, etc. And in the case of public issuance, how or what are the best ways to organize custody of the token for the holders? Simon, would you like to start?
I can give it a try. So financial institutions, of course, have a history of storing assets, and I think that's an advantage. And whether it's digital assets, of course, you have to store them differently. But the thing is, if we lose today an asset, we will be sued. So if we will lose a digital asset, we will be sued as well. So we have to take care of that. And we also have systems today for bank account money, of course, and also for custody business for regular assets as well as the CSDs do, for example. So I think the one who will hold the digital asset physically or legally, they will be the risk taker. And the question will be on the long term if individuals want to be the risk taker for securities. I don't think so. I think there will be a digital custody business, which should be a regulated business as well, because the assets are still the same. So we have to comply with the same standards of custody business as is, but we simply need other infrastructures for that. That could even be cloud-based with service level agreements, but then you may have to pay a bit more for these service level agreements. Yeah.
Thank you. Right?
I think there's tons of things to say on custody of digital assets. It's a very complicated topic, and there needs to be a lot of design thinking around how do you design your cold wallet, how do you design your hot wallet, how do you interoperate between these wallets. In terms of a cold wallet, what kind of architecture will you have, how many signatures, who will be authorized, who will be the external partners. And obviously, to a certain extent, you can't really delve into too much of that because you would be actually sharing your own, secret sauce as a company. But what's really important to understand is that today there are some technical answers to, have a really good custody of assets. It's never perfect. Hence the need for auditing the custodian solution, and hence the need for insurance of these funds. And when you look at the European market, if you go and look at the US with BitGo, with Gemini custody, with Fidelity custody, you do see that there's already some insurers that are ready to go and insure these custodians. Whereas here in Europe, we still haven't found the relevant insurances that are ready to insure these custodians. So speaking of a very personal story here, but still working on these topics of auditing the custodian and insuring the custodian, which is very important for customers, would they be institutional or retail customers?
Thank you.
Well, it's a difficult question and a technical question, I would say. But for custodians, at least the assets must be secured, and cybersecurity is a challenge. In the PAC law introduces a core set of overarching rules, regardless to the type of service offered, and also specific rules for depending on the activities undertaken, especially custody. And among the overarching rules, a robust IT system, so cybersecurity is mandatory. Is included, and an instruction, an instruction about cybersecurity will be published also in the coming months. It is, in fact, it's already drafted, but it must be validated by our national cybersecurity agency. and the level of requirements will depend on every service. And for custody, custody is the most will have the highest level of requirements in this topic.
Thank you.
I mean, many things are possible technically and from a regulatory standpoint. I get the feeling that in the short term, the way that custody is going to be organized is not that complicated. So I think my perception is that in most cases, when it's about security tokens, the issuer will essentially be self-custodian of the registry of ownership. The no transfer of the security will be possible without a confirmation by the issuer. The issuer will have the ability to overwrite any transfer if for some reason there was a mistake that was done by the KYC verificators, or if there was a fork in the blockchain, or if for some reason a transaction should have gone through and was rejected. And so I think my perception is that in most cases, the issuer will have a lot of responsibility in terms of maintaining the registry of ownership of the security. And then there will be various providers of software and services who will help the end investors safeguard their public keys, their private keys. But those private keys will mostly look like, will mostly be authentication mechanisms, login mechanisms that provide investors the ability to trigger transactions, but those transactions will, in practice, will have to be countersigned or authorized by the issuer. And so I don't see custody as such a big complication in the short term. Again, in the context that for now, I think STOs are going to be issued in a way that we're using the blockchain as a ledger where we write who owns what and we record transactions. But basically, it's not very different from having the issuer maintain an Excel spreadsheet where they operate themselves changes in ownerships when a trade gets completed.
Maybe just that, because I think that's a very important point. I'm not sure if it's the issuer or the long run who will have to do all this stuff. Maybe it is legally, and then he will have service providers doing that. But I have to agree very much, because these characteristics described from an architectural perspective also imply that you can actually do this for security tokens only in a permissioned based, because you simply have to, and you can of course use a public chain where you do whitelisting and stuff, but that's an implicit permission actually if you whitelist it. So the thing is, you have to have a specific kind of network control, and the reason is if you have a false transfer, which might take place, or even a transfer outside the network, which is technically possible sometimes, or legally, that has to depend on the legislation then later on. The thing is, you need these kind of architectures to ensure all the rights as described, and I think that's very important for the discussion at whole.
Please let me add something. From a regulatory standpoint, I think that we must remain neutral to technology and neutral to the way of safekeeping the assets. So hard wallet, cold wallet, multi-signature, or even smart contracts. I think that all these technical ways are may fit, may be convenient. Only the principle. We should have a principle-based approach in this.
Thank you.
Just to add on that, I think there's two different topics here on custody. There's the custody on permissionless blockchains and on permissioned blockchains, and one seems to be easier than the other one due to the technical design constraints of it. So obviously, in terms of permission blockchains, I think the question lays on the insurer and on the regulatory authority, but on the permissionless blockchains, the technicality and the environment and the ecosystem around the custodian is quite important to evaluate also from a regulatory point of view.
So just one comment on this. I don't necessarily see a huge distinction between permissioned and permissionless blockchains in this context, because if your permission blockchain becomes big enough, actually getting everyone to coordinate to rewrite a transaction or fork the blockchain and go back in history is a hugely complex endeavor, and it's not. So you'd like to avoid it as much as possible, and so you'd like to design your smart contracts in a way that you enable those functionalities, forced transfer, overrides, etc., without necessarily having to stop all the computers and go back in history. And so in a way, there are techniques that we're using now on public blockchains, mostly resolving around the intersection of decentralized identity and tokenization of assets. Essentially, what we're doing is we're creating certificates that need to be injected in every single transaction as a proof that the transfer has been pre-authorized by the issuer or by the KYC contractor or by whoever else. And so by injecting those certificates and making that a requirement for every single transaction, we're enforcing a fairly good control on the smart contract, whatever the technology underneath the smart contract. And so I totally agree that in most cases, we're seeing enterprises more comfortable issuing first on permission blockchains because they need to have a longer experience with those technologies. However, simply saying permission blockchain are an easy way to rewrite history, in practice is not much simpler than the way you would have to do it on a public network.
Maybe how do we design it? We don't roll back in time, of course. That wouldn't make sense in the whole concept. But you can have a counter booking, for example, if it's agreed that there was a false transaction. And so this is for securities, and this is only for securities. And I mean it in the traditional term, how securities are defined. Each investor needs to go through a KYC. So that's like simply technically a permission. A KYC is a permission. I have to prove if you can buy the security. And for this reason, I would say for the pure handling of securities, that is something where you have a permission. Yeah, and it can be built within a public system if you have a whitelisting as an oracle, for example, of course. But that's also then somehow a permission. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Very good discussion on that topic. As we know, digital assets can have rights associated to them, such as voting rights, dividend rights, corporate actions. So the question I have is how to implement and monitor these rights that are associated with a digital asset. Would someone like to begin? Alexander?
Okay. First, we think that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and unfortunately, a case-by-case study is necessary to know if a token grant is such that it is to be considered as a security token or not. I think it was mentioned before in the previous roundtable, but in Europe, the securities are defined such that few tokens are securities. I think it's not the same in the US, and at least under French law, the transposition is such, it's not even a transposition, it was before, but a security can only be either a share, basically, or a debt instrument, or a share of fund, or derivatives. So in all other cases, the tokens are not regulated by the MiFID, by MiFID, by prospectus, MAR, etc. So there was, I think, there was a legal vacuum for anything which is not a security. So utility tokens, currency tokens, consumption tokens, whatever. And so the national regime introduced by the Pact law is has its scope exactly defined as all the tokens which are not financial instruments. So the scope is anything which is not a security token. Having said that, a token which is a share is basically a token giving right to a dividend or a property right. So a token, the rights given by granted by the token are the criterion which has to be regarded.
So there have been a few token issuances that were done by major financial institutions, the World Bank, Société Générale a couple of weeks ago. Commerzbank has some experience in this as well. I believe that in every single case, the issuance of the security token was accompanied by the signature of a contract between the parties that specified what legal rights they had and to what extent those legal rights were represented or enforced by the automated manifestation of the token in the form of a smart contract. And so the broad answer to the question that you asked, Susan, is that the way that those legal rights right now are given to investors is simply by a legal contract. There are some tactical questions that have arisen as to whether the signature of a legal contract by way of a blockchain transaction is legally enforceable. Many people are working on different forms of legal contracts that specifically refer to the smart contracts or the address of the smart contract as the way that a certain clause will be executed. And so there is more integration right now between the legal literature and its implementation in technology. But broadly, it's always about a contract that has to be signed at some point between the counterparties.
Thank you. I can give some insight into that, how we did it, for example. So in our case, we had a legal framework as a contract that was then issued when the actual cash state, the security state, we used Corda, was created. So the contract is using the parameters of the state or the token to print out a contract, technically, not physically. And the question is then, a very good one, is the kind of signature you can use. Because within Europe, of course, if you want to sign a global node of a security, that needs, if you want to do that electronically, a qualified electronic signature. So that was at first an issue for us because, of course, we don't have a qualified right to do a qualified electronic signature ourselves. So we needed to implement a partner who was able to provide the electronic qualified signature, and then the contract was signed electronically to keep the security electronically on ledger, so that you don't have cross references in legacy systems and the paper-based global node. And then a hash of this signed document was created, which was added to the state itself. So you can always go back and see if the global node that is created via the instance of the smart contract is actually the signed security. And this was a service that we provided as a bank then, that we did store technically the signed PDF. So everyone could regenerate the hash of the signed global node to check if that's really the conditions that were signed before at the issuance.
Thank you. So this is a broad question. Who can have control over the digital assets after issuance? And can the issuer always retain a right on the digital assets that they've issued? Okay.
I think we've answered that question more or less. Okay. So, in theory, anything is possible, but in practice, right now, for institutions that are issuing tokens, security tokens right now, they are always retaining some way of being able to force transactions, rewrite the balances, overwrite something, because it's just too risky for them to let those contracts live without having any ability to control them. So right now, that's the way it's happening. Of course, as people get more comfortable, we'll see many more situations where smart contracts are left to live their life and no one can interfere with them, but we're not there yet.
Maybe only also the experience. I think what is really a positive aspect of the technological implementation, really sticking to the smart contract, is that you can do an automated, legally binding execution of the lifecycle of the security. And so for our transaction, the security was really redeemed automatically on a second basis. So we knew exactly at a second when the paper was redeemed, and everybody in the network knew that it was redeemed at that very second, and that also reduces the risks, of course. And so for securities, normally you know the life cycle of the security when you issue them. Yeah, you have already predefined them, and now you can put it into code, so people can already see that it really executes, and that's something that's very nice. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add on that, who has control over the assets after the issuance, that really depends on what type of assets we're talking about. Obviously, if they are crypto assets or security tokens or utility tokens, there'll be different people. And in that regards, the European Central Bank actually released a paper 2 weeks ago with an interesting definition from the people writing the paper, which basically said that a crypto asset is an asset whereby the control and the supply and the agreement over the validity of transfers are not enforced by an accountable party, but are induced by the use of cryptographic tools, meaning the asset ownership is actually linked to the person who has this cryptographic tool, meaning the private key. Would it be, the custodian, the actual individual, or the issuer before issuance?
Thank you. Okay, so in the case of digital twins, how do you establish legally the link between the token's ownership and the physical asset ownership? I see Simon grinning down there. I'm not sure why.
So I can take. I think the question moves us quite far away from financial instruments, I would say. So I think the question is very relevant in the case where we're issuing digital assets that represent physical goods, and that's what you are asking about. And indeed, so recently we started demoing a platform that we built with a luxury group that is used to track ownership and authenticity of luxury products. And so that, we had to struggle with that question a lot because there are some high value goods, whether they are leather bags or containers, where I think the value of the goods makes it economically possible to embed a tamper-resistant sensor or chip in them, and therefore to have some kind of inviolatable identification of the objects. But there are many other goods where it's simply not practical to implement tight security. So you have to rely on engravings or simply QR codes. And so what we found is that ultimately, whether or not you can establish a link between the digital asset and the physical asset, again, will be determined by terms and conditions and some kind of contract. What's very interesting with luxury goods was that in the end, we realized that we don't always need to identify the leather bag uniquely or a pair of shoes, let's say. What we need to determine is that the owner of the private key can demonstrate that they own at least one of those items. Right? And so let's say if I buy 10 pairs of shoes that are very expensive, I will have inherited from 10 cryptographic certificates attached to my private key. I only need to be able to prove that I own 10 certificates and that I own 10 pairs of shoes. I don't necessarily need to prove that the shoe number 1 corresponds to certificate number 1. And so there are situations where the fact that blockchain creates not only digital assets, but an immutable link between the owner of those assets and the physical goods makes it possible to lessen the requirements to identify uniquely what those assets are. I don't know if that's very clear, but.
Thank you. Anyone else to add on that? Okay, we'll move on to our next question. So we have one more question, and then we'll open it up again to the participants. So what are the stakes regarding the legal status of the token? And what happens if the token is burned or stolen related to the ownership of the token then? Simon?
Maybe start. So I think that's also something where, of course, it's much easier if you have a permissioned approach. It's easier. Yeah, that doesn't mean it's the better solution. It's simply easier. Yeah. However, I think regarding this question is what we have to keep in mind is that the token, the state, the asset, how you may call it, is at last a technical representation. And that's very important to keep in mind. Because sometimes we think we need to regulate something completely new, but actually it's simply another technical representation of something that we already know. So of course, the technology enables new products. And if you have new products that differ from current products structurally, then we can say there is maybe a legislative lag that we have to fill, and that we have to provide standards for the issues that arise with the management of all these assets. But if there is structurally a similarity to existing assets, and that's the case, I think, for a lot of assets out there, then my approach would be to use legislation as is, but to make them technologically neutral. And that's a very important stance I would take here. Because a lot of legislation is not technology neutral, especially in the security business, where you have laws that secure the role of the CSDs, where you have laws that secure the role of the paper or of market structures. And I would like to challenge that a lot.
Thank you, Simon. Alexander?
Yes, I want to say that in fact what is at stake is everything because if the property rights are not recognized on the blockchain, then some projects, some markets cannot develop. I think without a legal recognition of property rights on the blockchain, some projects are not feasible completely. So it's an obstacle of the.
I think we've reached a point where maybe we want to answer your question. Would you like to ask it again?
No. Shall I start again? No, actually. Okay, thank you for giving me the chance once again to raise the question. Basically, the point is, with regard to the securities token which are representing financial assets, I think the fair assumption would be then the existing regulatory framework would then apply. And then the key question for you would be, based on your experience, concrete experience on the field, would you already have a key element of the existing regulatory framework which would somehow prevent the take-up of the security token issuance? And if so, whether you could share already with us, or element which are basically missing in the existing regulatory framework and that should be addressed to facilitate the cap, keeping in mind the principle I fully agree with of technology neutrality, because I appreciate that you very much refer to DLT, blockchain, but there may be other types of technology usage which could also be of interest to exploit. So thank you.
So just some concrete examples of what is like putting us a bit back within the process or taking us some more time. The thing is, with security laws, of course, they are on a national basis. So they are influenced by EU legislation, of course, but they are done on a national basis. So we did our first transaction within German law, and in German law you have the so-called Wertpapierhandelsgesetz, and the Wertpapierhandelsgesetz says that you have to use a paper. That's not so much technologically neutral. So we already addressed these at the German state, and I think they are quite doing well in rethinking that. Then we moved to Luxembourg for the issuance. So before the law changed, we appreciate much that the law changed even further now. So we thought at first we'll use the digital security, which was something that was like besides normal securities as an asset. And we thought, okay, cool, they have these digital securities that are already dematerialized at the issuance. But the thing was, in this law, for example, it said you have to use a CSD then. So that wasn't technology neutral as well. And so I think I can't speak for every legislation. We did a transaction also in the UK law, which was quite okay. I think France moved quite much forward with legislation right now, and is really also very interesting. We honestly simply didn't consider France in this transaction because we didn't want to translate all the changes that we had into French. Yeah, so we took Luxembourg. Yeah, so sometimes it's also this kind of thing because you have a lot of legal ping pong. Yeah, for these kind of transactions. So that's effort then as well. So I would say it's right now, and that's part of the difficulty as well, as it is on a national basis. I think security tokens will also need a much more stronger joint effort in the European Union. Without taking the word into mouth that not everybody is thinking about, yeah. And I think this is very important, setting standards, getting the capital markets within the European Union at last closer together in terms of regulation, and then putting that through on a national basis as well, technology neutral.
First, I fully agree with Simon, and I would. Well, we are working at the AMF on this topic precisely, and our first conclusions are that there are obstacles for the development of security tokens, for listed security tokens, to be more precise. The first obstacle would be CSDR. I mean, the necessity to have a central custodian. Probably also in MiFID some obligations, some requirements about the MTFs and regulated markets. With our first conclusions are also that for clearing there is no problem because clearing is not a requirement. If we read the framework, and concerning prospectus, I would say so for the primary market that yes, some things are missing. And first of all, I would say the AML, because the issuer should be. We think that the issuer should be responsible of the AML CFT process, and after that, delegated or not, but. As the operation of ICO or STO is disintermediated, there is no bank responsible for it, so there must be someone. So this is probably missing, and probably also some requirements about cybersecurity, so security of funds raised, be they cryptocurrencies or fiat currencies. And probably it's also too heavy for at least for startups. So there would be a need of more proportionality for their case at least. These are our first conclusions.
We have additional questions from the audience for the panel today, or any comments or insights to add?
Bernard Nicolai, I'm lecturing banking and finance at the University of Brussels, Solvay Brussels School. So, broader question, maybe not specifically relating to regulatory also, but according to you and according to your experience, what prevents today mainly the adoption of digital assets by issuers? When concretely you talk to issuers, potential issuers, corporate clients, maybe big SMEs or private companies, startups, and they say no to you. Despite all the benefits that were described before, what do they say to you? And then what can we do about it?
Right now, I think we simply show them the effort that the issuance on DLT means right now still. And then they say, I have to reconsider. Because, of course, as a bank, we won't take all the effort on our own. And the thing is, I think you said it also before, like the costs of a DLT issuance or all this stuff right now may be even higher than traditionally, because there is no legal standard for this, so you have to take an external counsel also. Then you, of course, have to develop platforms that are not right there right now. So we also make corporations where we work with corporates together on the platform. So each of them puts developers onto the project to jointly develop it. So I think it's simply right now the effort, and that there is no conclusive system right now where all the homework is done so that you can simply onboard new clients. But each transaction or each kind of project you start requires new effort. Yeah.
Thank you. Did we have a question in the back?
You hear me? Yeah, I think.
Yes.
My question is rather technical than regulatory. I'm working in the edge of kind of partial in the edge of blockchain and data economy. So my question is how token can be kind of attached to the digital asset. Imagine the digital asset is a bunch of big data sets that between different industry partners are going to be exchanged in a permission blockchain. How can we make sure that these digital asset that here is a bunch of big data sets of different industry that they want to trade it between different, sectors in a permission blockchain, how can we make sure that they remain as they were promised, or how they are going to be traded over this permission marketplace, but still their legality, their custody can remain in place?
Didn't quite get the question. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do you hear me now? It's better. When you have a bunch of data sets, imagine you are working in an AI-related industry, and this data set is a digital asset that you want to trade over a permission marketplace with your clients. You are a company that you collect data and you're going to trade this. And this data needs to be somehow verified, and these tokens should be kind of attached to this, because these data are not like of small sizes that they're like transactions can be verified over the network. While these data sets or these big digital assets are going to be traded over this marketplace, how we can make sure that their authenticity remain in place. I don't know, maybe I'm not asking the correct audience, but since it was about the also legal issue and custody of this kind of digital assets, I rather wanted to ask if someone has any idea, because it's something that we are now working on, and we are very curious how we can tackle this issue.
Maybe the question or the answer. So maybe the answer is too simple, but you can simply, of course, hash the whole bunch of data and then trade the hash on chain. But the thing is, of course, then you can't control the data quality or anything like that. But simply like to make the data tradable and also traceable, then you can trade a hash of that data, of course.
You're going to attach the hash of data to like terabits of data, and while you are transferring over the marketplace? I mean, how is that?
No. You take the bunch of data, you hash it, you put the hash on the permission chain, trade it, and then anyone who receives the data can check if that data is actually the data that was traded due to the hash.
Before the next question, does anyone in the workshop have an answer as well for that question? Okay, thank you. Gentlemen.
European Commissioner, Lucas Repa again. So what would interest us, Simon, is to understand how much the solution that you developed at Commerzbank can scale and how much Commerzbank has been looking to other partners in the financial services sector that would be interested to share the product that you've developed and to scale it together, with the background that Barclays has in 2016 already done a similar pilot, I understand, and Erste Bank has last year also issued bonds on the blockchain. So is there critical mass meanwhile to develop something pan-European that can scale together?
Sorry, I have to correct. Erste issued Schuldscheine on the blockchain, so that's not a bond. That's very important for us always. But besides, no, that's okay. But besides, we actually developed the basis of the technology together in a joint R3 project with other banks, with KBC, ABN AMRO, for example, ING. So actually, we are quite into joint efforts in the financial sector, and of course, this can't be on the long term a Commerzbank only solution. Definitely not. And so we are also happy to share and engage other partners. Right now, what is hindering us from scaling? Simply, we have to do like a lot of homework to put this into a productive environment, and not into productive, but a productive, stable environment where I can simply onboard new clients. Right now, this is only OTC business also. So that is something which is important to say, but it is for our corporate clients okay. Yeah, they're fine with it for some terms, for some specific refinancing products that we put on there. So I think actually there needs to be simply put more work into it, and then do something like regular onboarding processes with regular background checks and so on, and then you can actually scale the software already. Yeah.
Thank you. Gentlemen, second row question?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, maybe I'm not getting the question right, but I think that the idea of building a European financial market for digital assets is a little bit like what we did in France when we built the Minitel for the internet, right? So if the financial markets today are extremely global. So if you're building something that is going to be less global than the legacy system, I'm not sure that anyone will adopt it. I think those markets by nature need to attract Asian and US capital and to be global if they are to have any value for financial actors.
Thank you, Ken. Sir?
Hello, I'm a researcher also at the Free University of Brussels, and I'm dealing with property rights and their replication through blockchain. I would like to ask a technical question as well. Apart from legislator, what else could we expect as a technique in order to enforce the digital ownership for underlying physical assets? For example, let's say land rights.
So what you're referring to is how can we give legal status of land rights which are now enforced by land registries and oftentimes notaries, right? I think the changes in regulation are necessary to make it happen. I don't get the feeling that in Europe, land purchases are the first use case that will propel the development of digital assets. And therefore, I think that addressing the points that Alexandre was making earlier for more abstract financial assets, removing the need for CMDs and MTF licenses in some cases, clarifying some aspects, I think that's a quick win that will develop the market at the right level of abstraction that is really required to finance companies, finance commodities, finance, and allow people to trade shares in various types of funds. Ultimately, we will get to a point where it will make sense to have fractional ownership of land or direct ownership of buildings. But right now, those markets are not liquid enough anyway, and not because of the market inefficiencies, just because there is not enough demand for them. And so I don't think that it's a priority. But ultimately, when everyone is comfortable with the technology, you could definitely imagine that land registries are put on a blockchain or electronic registry, that digital certificates are issued in lieu of paper certificates. Many countries are thinking about that, more emerging countries and countries in the Middle East. I think it's a technologically quite simple thing to achieve, but it's not a priority, I think, in Europe.
Thank you. We have time for one more question before lunch. Yes.
So I work for an investment management bank. Thank you very much for your insights. Simon, I think you touched on a quite interesting point that for me is may be required for large-scale implementation of digital assets trading, which is not very sexy, but it's risk management. So you said your risk management department was actually glad that you're able to lower the counterparty risk on the deals. But all of us who have worked in risk, we know that you usually transfer and share risk. So when you close some place, it usually appears some other way. So I think one of the points where it could appear would be in a high risk on litigation on the final use, the end user that has seen that risk transfer to him or her, as a matter of fact, more in the retail investor, which is actually being more protected every day from his actual knowledge of the financial instrument. So I can see how this could build an opposing trajectory for what the regulator is trying to do globally in Europe. And then again, I'm sure that there are other sources of risk that would appear if this could keep on growing, because it's actually a different operational framework. So we are not even finished with operational risk under Basel II and Basel III, and now you set on us a completely different operational framework. Thank you guys for your efforts on this. So I don't know if you can share some insights from your risk unit on this aspect of what are the main worries that they may have expressed if this grows, because there is a lack of databases on failed operations because all of this is new. I don't think we can actually elaborate on what could be the black swans that are waiting for us in the road ahead. So maybe you can share some of these insights with us. Thank you very much.
So maybe if I got it correct, I think like the black swan regarding the risk in this infrastructure moves moves stronger, at least from a market risk to a technical risk. And that's, of course, the big advantage of the permission system, that has to be said, yeah, that you have a gatekeeper. And of course, if you can penetrate the gatekeeper, you still have the record of the old data, but at least for for some moments, yeah, you might put high liquidity at risks, or they may not be addressable. Yeah, so that's something, of course, that is a structural risk for these kind of systems, and we have to keep that in mind. Additionally, also, but then again, that's why we use the permission systems. If someone, of course, gets the ownership of the digital assets unlegally, then he can execute transactions. And that's also for us an argument to say, if you have somehow a permission system, you can maybe do counter bookings to prevent that. But then again, you're moving the risk to the gatekeeper. So it's a technical kind of risk management, which the banks or the financial institutions in general may not have all the skills necessary yet to manage that. Which might be something that also needs to be regulated, actually. I want to say that loud, but actually it would make sense, yeah. So I think the risks moves, and but overall I think it's reduced risk. And we had one partner, KfW, in our first transaction, and they really knew what they were talking about in regard to these risks, because they transferred on some date in 2008 some kind of liquidity into the American market, yeah, which was then gone. That was a real counterparty risk, which was quite expensive. So I think in total, it's better for the risk departments. Yeah. If that sounds right.
Thank you.
Well, I think that the regulation may help, and the main risk maybe on the internet for these kind of assets is the lack of transparency and asymmetry of information between the investor and the professional. So I think that more regulation may help to reduce these risks, basically. But I suppose we need time to get this.
Anything else to add before we break for lunch? Okay, so we will be breaking for lunch now and returning back to the room at 1:30, where we will have additional panel conversations as well as a workshop. So everyone's welcome to have lunch and enjoy. Thank you to our panel.